The first days of October 1897 brought with them a stifling, almost unnatural heat to the outskirts of Montgomery, the kind that pressed down upon the rolling red soil fields until the very horizon seemed to blur beneath its weight. Local newspapers of the period make passing note of this short-lived heat wave, a warm spell unusual for the season. Yet those clipped reports fail to capture how it fell upon the land itself, how the air lay heavy over the Hartwell estate like a damp quilt left too long in a sealed attic. Visitors who approached the property in those days often remarked, in letters later preserved in county archives, that the humidity seemed to rise directly from the earth beneath one's boots rather than from any discernible source in the sky, carrying with it the smells of clay, wilted grass, and faint wood rot from the long-neglected structures on the estate's far edges. This weather, though brief, left a peculiar impression on those who passed through it, and in hindsight the oppressive heat seems a fitting atmospheric prologue to the events soon to unfold within the boundaries of Eleanor Hartwell's declining yet still imposing property. The house itself, built in 1859 at the height of antebellum confidence, sat on a slight incline overlooking a tangled expanse of pecan trees and unpruned hedges that had once formed a manicured garden. Visitors who approached by carriage along the narrow, rutted road noted the building's symmetry, its tall white columns, its two-story balcony encircling the front, and the high windows made to open fully to let in air during Alabama's fiercest summers. But those same visitors, in private correspondences, also noted the subtle signs of decline. Peeling paint that curled at the edges like brittle parchment, weeds pushing up between each brick step, shutters that no longer sat evenly against the walls, a faint sag in the rear portion of the roof, and a thin, persistent crack running from the southwest corner foundation upward past the window of the old study. Nothing catastrophic, nothing that would suggest total disrepair, but enough to imply that the estate was being maintained just well enough to appear functional and no more. The grand facade served as a kind of mask, preserving the illusion of wealth and stability while concealing the slow erosion taking place behind closed doors. At the center of this fading world lived Eleanor Hartwell, a widow of 43 whose presence in the local community had diminished sharply since her husband's death 2 years prior. County records from 1895 still list her as the owner of 3 adjoining parcels of land totaling more than 400 acres, as well as several investments in cotton mills and a modest share in a Montgomery timber concern. Yet by 1897 her public appearances had grown infrequent, and her correspondence, once brisk and businesslike, had become delayed, inconsistent, sometimes stopped altogether. Neighbors occasionally glimpsed her standing on the upper balcony in the early mornings, her figure motionless against the wooden balustrade, dressed in black despite the heat. Those who greeted her from a distance seldom received more than a faint nod in response, and even that small courtesy seemed given with a reluctance bordering on fatigue. Some speculated it was grief that consumed her. Others believed it was mere reclusiveness. But a smaller number, particularly those who had dealt with her late husband's business affairs, wondered quietly whether something else, something less easily named, had taken hold within the walls of the Hartwell home. The servants of the estate, numbering 4 at the time, Samuel Price, the steward, Lydia Cole, the housekeeper, Ruth Ann, the cook, and a young groundsman named Thomas, occupied the rear quarters built behind the main house. These quarters, while not large, were structurally sound. Simple wooden structures with shuttered windows, tin roofs, and narrow porches shaded by the overhanging limbs of the pecan grove. To outward eyes, they lived modestly and worked with an unremarkable diligence, rarely speaking unless spoken to, moving through the estate with a quiet efficiency that could be interpreted as loyalty just as easily as caution. Their duties were predictable. Samuel handled the estate's financial papers, incoming mail, and household logistics. Lydia maintained the interior rooms, Ruth and prepared meals, and Thomas tended to the grounds. Nothing about their routine, at least at first observation, would have suggested the subtle consolidation of influence that was beginning to take place. But contemporary testimonies gathered decades later hint at small, ambiguous behaviors that, even at the time, struck certain visitors as unusual. A traveling solicitor recorded in his notebook that Samuel refused him entry to the main hall, insisting Eleanor was indisposed despite the fact that the solicitor had heard footsteps on the balcony just moments earlier. A cousin of Eleanor's, who visited only once in late September, later described in a letter the peculiar air of defensiveness with which Lydia met her inquiries about Eleanor's health. Ruth Ann, typically described as soft-spoken and obliging, once told a deliverman that no further ledgers were needed, even though the estate historically received such ledgers monthly. Thomas, though only 19, was said to watch visitors with an intensity that felt out of place for a groundsman tasked only with simple outdoor labor. None of these behaviors were overt acts of defiance. None could be definitively labeled as wrongdoing, but taken together, they formed a pattern of guardedness that some observers found difficult to dismiss. Within the house, the atmosphere was even more strained. The interior, though clean, felt strangely devoid of the warmth that had once characterized Southern homes of the era. Long hallways echoed with the faint sound of footsteps carrying through the wooden floors. Rooms felt either too meticulously arranged or curiously untouched. Curtains remained drawn even on bright days, and the parlor, once the social center of the household, was now used so rarely that a thin layer of dust formed along the edges of the mahogany table. Eleanor, according to one visitor's later account, walked through these rooms as though they no longer belonged to her. She moved slowly, her shoulders slightly hunched, her hands often clasped in front of her as if to steady herself. She spoke softly, with an almost apologetic tone, and rarely looked directly at the person addressing her. It was said that she seemed to listen to the house itself more than to her guests, as though catching faint murmurs from distant rooms, or waiting for the sound of footsteps beyond her control. This slow erosion of authority became apparent in a series of small, almost imperceptible incidents, none dramatic enough to warrant immediate alarm, yet each building toward a subtle but undeniable shift in the household's balance of power. On the second day of October, A letter from Eleanor's sister in Georgia arrived, yet it was not Eleanor who received it first, but Samuel, who tucked it beneath a ledger on his desk with the claim that he would deliver it directly. Whether he ever did remains uncertain, for the letter was later found, unopened, among a stack of outdated receipts. Later that week, a merchant in Montgomery sent notice that a payment for ordered supplies was overdue, despite Samuel's earlier assurance that all accounts had been settled. Eleanor, when informed, responded with evident confusion and an apology that did not seem rooted in any clear understanding of what had transpired. The merchant noted that she appeared detached, almost displaced from the facts, and that she deferred to Samuel with an instinct bordering on reflex. It is tempting, with modern hindsight, to interpret these early signs as warnings of coordinated manipulation. Yet to observers of the time, accustomed to rigid social hierarchies and to the retreat of widows into domestic seclusion, these incidents might easily have been dismissed as mere administrative missteps or the natural consequence of grief. The servant's increasing control over logistics, finances, and correspondence could be rationalized as practical necessity, a fragile widow relying on those who kept her household functioning. Only in retrospect does the quiet dread beneath these events become visible, like a watermark revealing itself on aged paper when held to the light. Meanwhile, Eleanor's own behavior grew more withdrawn. She spent long periods on the second-floor gallery, staring toward the tree line as though expecting someone, or something, to emerge from it. Her clothing, once varied in texture and color, narrowed to a small selection of dark gowns that she wore regardless of temperature. Lydia, when asked about this change, attributed it to the lingering sorrow of her loss, but neighbors whispered that the widow seemed more a guest in her own home than its mistress. One neighbor, a woman known for her forthrightness, remarked that Eleanor's voice, when she spoke, carried the hesitant tone of someone requesting permission rather than giving direction. Another noted that she hesitated before entering certain rooms, glancing down the hallway first as though seeking some silent cue from an unseen observer. It was during these first days of October that the earliest rumor of mismanaged funds began to circulate quietly among the estate's former business contacts. A clerk at the Montgomery Bank reported that a withdrawal had been made not by Eleanor herself, but by Samuel, authorized by a signature that, though technically valid, appeared shakier than the confident script Eleanor had used in past years. When asked, Samuel explained that the widow had entrusted him with handling her more cumbersome financial errands, citing her fragile health. The bank did not question the matter further, yet the clerk, in a later deposition, remarked that something in Samuel's demeanor, composed but slightly too composed, gave him pause. Another turning point, minor but telling, occurred when a visiting reverend arrived to offer prayer and companionship, as he had done periodically since Eleanor's bereavement. Thomas met him at the gate and informed him that Mrs. Hartwell was resting and could not receive guests. The Reverend later noted that he saw, from his vantage point on the drive, a figure resembling Eleanor standing behind the parlor window curtain, watching. Whether she wished to decline the visit or was prevented from accepting it remains unknown, but the incident added to the growing sense that access to the widow was being filtered, controlled, perhaps even restricted. Throughout these early days, a quiet, suffocating dread settled over the estate like the lingering heat that refused to dissipate. The unspoken hierarchy, once clear and orderly, seemed subtly inverted. Orders went unspoken, yet were somehow followed. Decisions appeared to emerge not from Eleanor's lips, but from the silent workings of those around her. Even the simplest gestures carried weight. The way Lydia placed a teacup before Eleanor as though reminding her to drink. The way Samuel hovered near doorways during conversations, as if absorbing every word spoken within the house. The way Ruth silently removed untouched meals, her expression unreadable. The way Thomas lingered near stairwells, watching who ascended and descended. No violent act occurred. No explicit threat was made. Yet the atmosphere thickened with the sense that something fundamental had shifted, something that could not be easily articulated, but was felt by all who stepped across the threshold. It was the dread of power unacknowledged yet undeniably present, the guilt of witnessing small injustices yet feeling unable to name them, the subtle fear that the natural order, however flawed or oppressive, had begun to slide into a more dangerous ambiguity. And beneath all of it ran the unsettling intuition that Eleanor herself sensed the change but could no longer find the words, or perhaps the will, to confront it. The heat wave that had lingered so stubbornly over the Hartwell estate finally broke in the second week of October. Yet the relief brought by the shifting weather did little to ease the household's growing tension. With the arrival of cooler winds came a new kind of heaviness, less physical, more psychological, as though the clearing air had revealed the architecture of a quiet struggle that had been forming behind the estate's shuttered windows. Several days had passed since the first rumors of delayed payments, withheld letters, and restricted visitors. But it was in the weeks that followed that the subtle rearrangements of authority became unmistakable. These changes did not occur in sudden leaps, but in the slow, creeping accumulation of small decisions, each one inconsequential on its own, yet together forming a pattern that could no longer be dismissed as miscommunication or grief. It was now evident that the Hartwell household was no longer operating under its old order, though no one could yet say with certainty what the new order actually was. The servants' assumption of control began, fittingly, with paperwork. Samuel Price, whose role as steward had always included some degree of administrative oversight, expanded his duties with such delicacy that even the most attentive observer might have missed the significance of his actions. Bank notices, which once arrived sealed and were placed directly in Eleanor's hands, now rested for days in Samuel's desk before she ever saw them, if she saw them at all. When a ledger went missing, he offered a calm explanation. "Misfiled, ma'am. I'll correct it." When a receipt was found incomplete, he reassured her. "A clerk's error, nothing more." And when Eleanor once expressed confusion about a withdrawal she did not recall authorizing, Samuel responded with a tone so gently patronizing that it almost passed for compassion. "You've been under strain, Mrs. Hartwell. Allow me to shoulder the burdens you need not trouble yourself with." His voice carried just enough warmth to soothe, yet just enough pressure to dissuade further questioning. It was an artful balancing act, one that blurred the line between assistance and appropriation. Lydia, too, stepped into a different role. While she had always kept the household running with quiet efficiency, she now became something of a gatekeeper, a position that, though subtle, gave her considerable influence over Eleanor's contact with the outside world. Visitors arriving unannounced were met with polite but firm refusals. Letters addressed to Eleanor were sorted with an increasingly selective hand, and even the interior movement of people within the house seemed subtly mediated by her. On at least 2 occasions, Eleanor rose from her seat in the parlor with the intention of attending to some matter in the upper hall, only for Lydia to intercept her with a remark about the lateness of the hour or the importance of rest. These interventions were small, easily interpreted as concern for a grieving widow's health, yet each one shifted a fragment of Eleanor's autonomy into Lydia's keeping. One letter, addressed from the Georgia estate of Eleanor's married sister, vanished entirely. Weeks later, it would be discovered tucked behind a stack of linens in a cupboard that only Lydia regularly accessed. Ruthyn's contributions to the shifting atmosphere were less administrative, but no less meaningful. She adjusted the household's routines, meal times, menus, even the availability of certain ingredients, without consulting Eleanor. When Eleanor once asked why the evening supper had been served earlier than usual, Ruthyn lowered her gaze and answered that she thought an earlier meal would be best for everyone. The phrasing struck Eleanor as odd, though she could not articulate precisely why. There was also the matter of the coffee. Eleanor's morning cup, once prepared exactly to her preference, now tasted slightly different, too weak on some days, too bitter on others. When she mentioned this, Ruthyn offered a vague apology, explaining that the imported blend had changed suppliers. Eleanor accepted the explanation, though a faint unease lingered. Thomas, the young groundsman, played the quietest role, yet perhaps the most visibly unsettling one. His duties placed him outside the house more often than within it, yet he seemed always to be near important thresholds: the back door when a delivery arrived, the main hall when a guest approached, the stairwell when Eleanor descended for supper. He seldom spoke, but his eyes tracked every movement with an attentiveness that bordered on vigilance. A visiting cousin described the boy's gaze as the kind one sees in a watchman, not a servant, though at the time the remark was dismissed as exaggeration. But it is clear in retrospect that Thomas's constant presence had a purpose. Whether assigned or self-imposed remains uncertain. Against this backdrop of subtle rearrangement, Eleanor's own decisions, quiet, hesitant, and increasingly shaped by the pressures around her, contributed to the moral ambiguity of the unfolding conflict. She signed documents she did not fully read, out of trust or exhaustion, or perhaps fear of seeming incapable. She declined invitations from acquaintances, citing ill health, though the words felt borrowed rather than genuinely felt. And there were moments when she looked upon the servants with an expression that suggested both need and apprehension, as though she recognized the growing imbalance but lacked the resolve to address it. Her silence, however involuntary, became part of the machinery that allowed the situation to continue. It was during the third week of October that the first act of clear boundary crossing occurred. A document, a routine authorization for the sale of a small acreage once used for tenant farming, was submitted to the county office bearing Eleanor's signature. The sale itself was unremarkable. The land had produced little income in recent years. What made the transaction notable was not the sale, but the signature. A clerk, comparing the flowing script to older documents, observed that the handwriting looked subtly altered, slanted more steeply, with heavier pressure on the downward strokes. Not forged, necessarily, but dated, inconsistent, as though written by a hand either trembling or unfamiliar with the motion. When he inquired whether Mrs. Hartwell had delivered the authorization personally, the answer he received was ambiguous. The document had been left at the office by a messenger who gave no name. The clerk made note of this discrepancy in his log, though no formal complaint was filed at the time. It was, however, the first instance of a legal boundary being crossed, quietly, plausibly, but unmistakably. Around the same time, another incident occurred that revealed the servant's tightening control over information reaching the widow. A local magistrate, who had once managed minor estate matters for the Hartwell family, attempted to visit Eleanor after receiving a delayed response to his correspondence. He was greeted at the door by Lydia, whose demeanor, politely regretful, firmly resolute, left no room for negotiation. "Mrs. Hartwell is not receiving visitors," she told him. When he asked whether the matter concerned her directly, Lydia paused for a fraction of a moment before replying, "It is not a suitable day for such business. I will inform her." As he turned to leave, the magistrate caught a glimpse of Eleanor standing at the far end of the hall, half hidden by a doorway. Their eyes met briefly. She raised her hand, hesitantly, almost as if in greeting or appeal, but Lydia shifted subtly, and the magistrate saw no more. He departed with the distinct impression that he had witnessed something significant, yet could not name. In households governed by rigid hierarchies, small rebellions often occur quietly, like faint cracks forming beneath a painted surface. One such crack appeared when Ruth Ann, against Samuel's instructions, confided to Eleanor that certain pantry supplies were running low because orders had not been placed on schedule. She spoke in a low voice, glancing toward the hallway as though expecting Samuel to appear at any moment. "He says the account's short," she whispered, "but it ain't never been short before." Eleanor, startled, asked her to repeat the statement, but Ruth Ann simply bowed her head and murmured that she had spoken out of turn. The moment passed, yet Eleanor sensed that the boundaries within her own home were shifting in ways she had not authorized nor fully understood. A few days later, Lydia intercepted a letter addressed to Eleanor from an old friend in Montgomery. The letter, found weeks afterward in the bottom drawer of Lydia's bureau, bore no sign of having been read by Eleanor. This act, small, secretive, and deliberate, marks one of the earliest unmistakable betrayals within the household. Whether Lydia withheld the letter out of misguided loyalty, protective instinct, or calculated control remains uncertain. But the result was clear. Eleanor continued her isolation, unaware of the inquiries and concerns gathering beyond her walls. Yet it must be noted that the servants' actions were not solely malicious nor entirely unified. In later accounts, some described Samuel as believing he was protecting the estate from Eleanor's weakened judgment following her husband's death. Others suggested Lydia feared that visitors or advisors might undermine the fragile equilibrium of the household, potentially leading to its collapse. Ruth, and torn between loyalty and conscience, oscillated between compliance and subtle resistance. Even Thomas, whose silence made him an unreadable figure, was said to have once hesitated when asked to bar a visitor from the grounds. These complexities remind us that the unfolding conflict was not a simple matter of oppression or rebellion, but a tangled web of fear, ambition, dependency, and survival. As the weeks progressed, Eleanor herself slipped deeper into a moral gray zone. She began to second-guess her own memory, uncertain whether she had misplaced documents or whether someone had moved them. She questioned her own instincts, wondering if her unease was the product of grief or imagination. At times she considered confronting Samuel or Lydia directly, but each time she imagined the conversation, she felt a tightening in her chest, a sensation not of physical ailment but of dread, as though some unspoken rule forbade her from asserting authority she no longer possessed. And so she remained silent, even as the evidence of lost autonomy grew clearer. The tension reached a new height when a boundary was crossed that could not be undone. One morning, Eleanor discovered that the key to her late husband's private desk drawer, the drawer containing ledgers, bonds, and personal correspondences, was missing from her dressing table. When she asked Samuel about it, his response was calm, almost rehearsed. "I moved it for safekeeping, ma'am. Those documents require proper management." Eleanor stared at him, unable to speak. In that moment, she understood that the drawer had been opened, its contents examined, and decisions made without her consent. This was not assistance. It was authority, and it had been taken, not granted. From that point onward, the air within the house grew sharper, tighter, as though the walls themselves listened. Whispered conversations between servants ceased the moment Eleanor entered a room. Thomas's watchful gaze followed her more openly. Lydia adjusted schedules without explanation. Ruth looked increasingly anxious, her eyes darting between Eleanor and the others as though she were caught between competing loyalties. The conflict had entered a new phase, no longer merely subtle rearrangements of domestic order, but active manipulation and containment. And yet, even here, the story defied simple categorizations of villain and victim. Every action taken by the servants carried a shadow of rationality. Every hesitation from Eleanor contained traces of complicity or fear. Responsibility blurred, morality frayed. Silence became both weapon and refuge. By the final week of October, the question was no longer whether the servants had assumed control, but how far that control would extend, and what, if anything, Eleanor could do to reclaim even a fraction of what had been quietly taken from her. The true escalation, its consequences, its costs, its irreversible shifts, would come in the weeks that followed. The weeks that followed were remembered, by the few who later dared to speak of them, as a season in which the walls of the Hartwell estate seemed to lean inward, as though the house itself were listening to its mistress's confusion with a patience bordering on cruelty. The oppressive Alabama humidity, which in earlier years Eleanor had accepted as an unavoidable aspect of rural life, now began to feel like a living presence that observed her declining authority with mute anticipation. The air hung thick with the scent of wet earth and fermenting magnolia blooms, and the heavy drapes, once symbols of wealth and taste, felt like velvet jaws closing over each window. It was during these long, airless afternoons that Eleanor began to sense, not through any single event, but through an accumulation of details, that she had ceased to act as the master of the estate and had instead become one of its occupants, tolerated but no longer obeyed. In the early days of this new phase, she attempted to reassert her authority through a series of letters addressed to her late husband's attorney, Mr. Lawson, who lived in Montgomery and had long handled the family's accounts. She wrote with careful restraint, the elegant cursive of her upbringing unchanged, yet her hand trembled faintly with each new sheet she filled. She requested updated ledgers, explanations for delays in payment, and an account of any recent withdrawals. But while she sealed each envelope with the same meticulous precision she had practiced since girlhood, she began to notice subtle variations in when the letters were taken from her writing desk and when new ones arrived. Variations that never quite aligned with the patterns she remembered from years past. One morning, she placed a letter prominently on the parlor table. 2 days later, it remained untouched. When she finally asked Samuel about the mail, he answered with a calculated softness, assuring her that the postal schedule had been delayed by weather and repairs to the road. He delivered this information not as a servant reporting to a mistress, but as someone offering a gentle correction to a misunderstanding, as though he had already accepted a role in which he, not she, was responsible for determining what she needed to know. This shift became even more apparent when Eleanor learned, by accident, that a visitor had been turned away from her doorstep. She was standing near the staircase landing, partially concealed by the shadows, when she heard muffled voices near the front hall, a man's confident tone, unfamiliar but polite, followed by Blanche's low, tense reply. When she descended the stairs a few minutes later, the hall was empty, save for Blanche herself, who stood rigidly with the dusting cloth still in her hand. "Who was here?" Eleanor asked. Blanche hesitated only a moment before explaining that a salesman had come requesting the mistress's attention, but she had protected Eleanor from an unnecessary disturbance. Her explanation was delivered with such startling composure that Eleanor found herself momentarily silenced. It was not the words but the assumption that arrested her. Blanche had not suggested that she could fetch Eleanor if the mistress wished. She had decided on Eleanor's behalf. These incidents, trivial on the surface, began to reveal the deeper currents at work within the estate. The servants no longer waited for instructions. They anticipated them, altered them, reshaped them. Eleanor began to observe how they exchanged glances with one another when she entered a room. Quick, silent, but unmistakably communicative. Their actions remained impeccably polite, yet something essential had shifted beneath that politeness. It was no longer deference, but choreography. She found herself, for the first time in her life, rehearsing her requests before speaking them, conscious of how they might be interpreted or quietly redirected. Driven by a growing sense of unease, Eleanor attempted to take more direct action. She retrieved the iron key to her late husband's study, a room she had rarely entered but now approached with a mixture of dread and necessity. The door resisted slightly when she opened it, as though it had not been moved in weeks, and inside she discovered that several of the drawers were unlocked and conspicuously empty. Important documents, property assessments, banking ledgers, correspondence with investors, were missing, though she could not prove when they had been removed or by whom. She searched the room slowly, methodically, her white gloves smudged with dust as she examined every shelf and file box. The absence of these papers was like a quiet accusation. Not only had she lost oversight of her finances, she had been losing it gradually, piece by piece, without noticing. This realization settled over her like a second skin, prickling her with shame and bitterness. Driven by equal parts fear and determination, Eleanor confronted Samuel in the library one late afternoon when the house lay in a heavy, expectant silence. She demanded an explanation for the missing documents. Samuel, standing beside the tall windows with the last orange threads of sunlight outlining his silhouette, listened with unbroken calm. His response, spoken slowly, as though addressing a child whose anxious imagination needed soothing, was that the files had been moved for safekeeping, given Eleanor's recent difficulties and strain. His tone was soft but laced with unmistakable authority, and when she asked him where the documents were now kept, he paused only long enough to convey that the answer was no longer hers to command. What unsettled her most was not his disobedience, but the certainty that he did not view it as disobedience at all. One of the most chilling moments in this period came in the form of a letter, one she was never meant to see. It was tucked behind a pile of linens in the upstairs storage wardrobe, discovered only because Eleanor had decided to inspect the household inventory herself. The letter, addressed to Samuel and signed by a name she did not recognize, detailed certain arrangements regarding the estate's accounts and referenced Eleanor's diminishing stability as justification for redirecting funds into a separate account managed by the household staff. The phrasing was meticulous and deliberately vague, written in a legalistic style that made her blood run cold. The implication was clear. Someone outside the house had been convinced that Eleanor was incapable of managing her own fortune, and that her servants had been appointed informally, perhaps even illegally, to manage it in her stead. After discovering the letter, she felt the air in the house change. Every room seemed to hold its breath. Every footstep behind her caused her shoulders to stiffen. In those days, Eleanor began to wonder how much of her previous life had been built upon the illusion of control rather than control itself. She felt the estate shifting beneath her, not physically but structurally, as though the hierarchy that had once been her foundation was quietly being inverted. Her dread grew so persistent that she summoned the courage to question one of the younger maids, Lila, whom she suspected might still harbor a fragile sense of loyalty. The conversation took place in the dim, dusty hallway outside the unused guest chambers, where the air smelled faintly of old wool and lavender sachets turned brittle with age. When Eleanor asked whether the letters she wrote were truly being delivered, Lila froze, her expression tightening with fear so sharp it bordered on pain. Though she attempted to compose herself, she could not hide the trembling in her hands. After a moment of silence, she whispered that she did not know about the mail and urged Eleanor to return to her room before anyone noticed she was wandering the upper floor unaccompanied. The warning was quiet, terrified, and sincere, and it confirmed everything Eleanor had feared. That night, as she lay awake listening to the cicadas screaming from the dark fields, she realized that the servants were no longer a single body with unified intention. There were fractures among them. People afraid, people ambitious, people trapped in a system that had begun to devour them as surely as it had begun to devour her. The first major confrontation came shortly afterward. Eleanor attempted once more to bypass the household's control by seeking help from the neighboring family whose land bordered the Hartwell estate. She left the house one morning under the pretense of inspecting the old orchard, but before she had traveled more than a quarter-mile, she found herself intercepted by Thomas, the groundskeeper. He stepped into her path with a politeness so rehearsed it felt theatrical, informing her that the heat was dangerous and the path overgrown, and that Samuel had instructed that she was not to leave the main grounds for her own safety. The words were delivered with the quiet firmness of a directive, not a suggestion. When she attempted to push past him, he did not raise his voice. He merely placed his hand on her arm, gently but with unmistakable strength. The humiliation of that moment, being physically restrained by someone who had once bowed his head when she entered the room, shattered the final remnants of her denial. She walked back to the house with measured grace, but inside she felt something break so deeply that it altered her very posture. Evidence of the servants' tightening control accumulated from that point forward. Candles removed for safety. Keys quietly replaced with ones that no longer fit their locks. Meals arriving earlier or later than expected with the soft implication that she no longer needed to concern herself with such trivialities. Even the soundscape of the house changed. Doors that once echoed now closed with a muffled certainty. Steps on the staircase grew regulated, patterned, as though the servants moved according to an unspoken schedule she was no longer privy to. The house felt increasingly like a well-run institution whose primary purpose was containment. What Eleanor did not yet understand, what she sensed only in the faint, aching way one senses a distant storm, is that her fear was mirrored by those around her. The servants, too, were bound within a system of their own making, one that had begun as a survival strategy, but was now expanding into something neither entirely rational nor entirely malicious. Their decisions were shaped by consequences they themselves feared, and their silence no longer signified obedience but desperation. Yet the moral distinction between fear and cruelty had begun to blur irrevocably. In her private journal, written in narrow lines across the margins of an old hymnal, the only object she knew the servants would not search, Eleanor recorded her growing sense of entrapment. The entries grew increasingly fragmented, marked by phrases such as "doors I once opened now close without me," "voices fall silent when I enter," and "the house knows I am no longer mistress." Her handwriting, once steady, became uneven, the ink at times smudged as though by her own trembling hand. It was during this period that she made the final attempt to reclaim her autonomy. She sought out the attic, a space rarely visited by anyone other than herself. She hoped to find her childhood trunk, which she remembered contained personal papers and letters from her parents, documents untouched by Samuel or by anyone in the modern household. But upon ascending the stairs, she discovered the attic door locked, the key missing from its usual hook. The dust on the floor near the door had been disturbed, revealing the marks of several footprints. Someone had been there recently. Someone had removed the last pieces of her past that had belonged solely to her. Standing there in the stale, overheated air, her skin prickling with sweat and humiliation, Eleanor realized with absolute clarity that the estate had become a closed system, one in which she was the only person without a role of power. And the worst part, the part that made her grip the banister until her knuckles blanched, was that she had helped build that system, brick by brick, year by year, through silence, custom, and unquestioned hierarchy. The house, once the symbol of her family's authority, was now the stage of her erasure. And somewhere within its walls, decisions about her life were being made without her knowledge, justified by whispered evidence of her declining judgment, reinforced by letters she had never seen and signatures she had never written. The horror was no longer subtle. It was structural, and it was tightening around her with every passing day. In the final days before the confrontation, the Hartwell estate entered a state of strained quiet that witnesses later described as the kind of silence that precedes a storm. The air hung thick with warnings unspoken, and every room seemed to wait for something to break. Even the servants, whose authority had grown steadily and almost organically over the past weeks, moved with a tension that suggested they sensed the nearing edge of a precipice. For Eleanor, this quiet was unbearable. She felt the weight of the house not as shelter, but as a pressure closing around her ribs, constraining her breath, urging her towards some inevitable reckoning. And though she could not have described it precisely, she understood intuitively that the moment was coming when someone, perhaps herself, would be forced beyond the line of civility that had defined the household for decades. The climax began on a morning when the sky was an unbroken sheet of white heat, and the cicadas had not yet begun their relentless chorus. Eleanor awoke with the feeling of being observed, though no one stood in her room. She rose with determination, her thin night-dress clinging to her from the humidity, and approached the locked wardrobe where she had recently found the incriminating letter. The wardrobe door, once subtly tampered with, now hung slightly ajar. Something inside had been disturbed. When she opened it, she discovered that the linens had been rearranged, but the letter was gone. In its place lay a single folded page in a hand she recognized at once as Samuel's, precise, restrained, and infuriatingly calm. The note, written with the mask of politeness that had become his armor, informed her that the estate's accounts were being managed responsibly, and that she needed to rest and trust those dedicated to her welfare. It was this phrase, dedicated to her welfare, that shattered the last of Eleanor's endurance. Her hands shook violently around the paper. If she did not act now, she understood she would never again act at all. She dressed abruptly, choosing a plain cotton dress rather than her usual formal attire, and descended the stairs with a swiftness that startled even herself. She moved through the hallway with the purpose of someone who knew she had no allies left. She marched straight toward the study she had found stripped of documents weeks earlier, intending, perhaps for the first time in her life, to demand, rather than request, access to her own property. The confrontation unfolded there, amidst the heavy smell of dust and old leather, with the shutters thrown half closed against the ruthless sun. Samuel was already waiting, as though he had anticipated her arrival. Behind him stood two of the senior servants, Thomas and Blanche, silent, rigid, their presence a silent statement that whatever was about to occur was not a misunderstanding, but a decision. A wave of dread swept through Eleanor's stomach, but she did not retreat. Instead, she demanded to see the financial records. Her voice, though quivering, held a strength she had not used in years. Samuel listened without interrupting, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression infuriatingly serene. When she finished, he exhaled once, almost pityingly, and delivered the blow with the gentleness of a man who believed himself merciful. "The accounts, Mrs. Hartwell," he said quietly, "no longer fall under your direct management." For a moment she could not respond. The room seemed to tilt, suffocating her with its heat. She stepped forward, insisting, nearly shouting, that the estate was hers, her inheritance, her responsibility. Samuel did not flinch. Instead, he motioned to Thomas, who produced a small packet of papers tied with string. When he handed them to her, Eleanor snatched them with trembling hands. Inside were the documents she had feared existed. Financial transfers, signed with her name. Transfers she had never authorized. Statements declaring her unfit to manage her own affairs due to emotional instability following bereavement. And worst of all, a notarized letter, written in a tone eerily similar to her own, requesting that the household staff assume temporary authority over all expenditures, contracts, and property decisions. The date on the letter corresponded to a week when she had been bedridden with illness the previous winter. Her gasp was not dramatic. It was small, strangled, and devastating. She felt as though someone had pressed a palm against her throat. "You forged this," she whispered. It was not an accusation of anger, but of despair. Samuel's reply came slowly, as though he wished the words to settle gently rather than strike sharply. "We did what was necessary to protect this household," he said. "And to protect you." Eleanor's vision blurred. She felt the blood drain from her face, leaving a cold hollowness behind her eyes. The servants watched her silently, their stances firm yet not hostile, as though they understood the cruelty of this moment but saw no alternative. It was Blanche who finally stepped forward, her voice softer than Eleanor had ever heard it. "No one meant harm, ma'am," she murmured. "But things had changed. We could not risk losing the estate. Not after all these years. Not after all we have done to keep it running. The implication, after all we have done, landed like a confession, yet it was not spoken with shame. It was spoken with conviction. In that instant, Eleanor understood something that made her knees weaken. The takeover had not begun as mutiny. It had begun as survival. Her absence from financial matters, her hesitations in recent months, her grief-clouded decisions. These had created gaps the servants filled, first out of necessity, then out of habit, and finally out of determination. What began as help had transformed into control, and now control had become ownership. But understanding did not reduce her terror. She stepped backward, the packet of forged documents falling from her hands onto the carpet. Her breath came unevenly as she tried to grasp the sheer enormity of what had been taken from her. As she turned to leave the study, Samuel moved slightly, not to block her path, but to ensure she did not flee in panic. The gesture, calm and measured, felt more violating than if he had shouted. Eleanor ran. Her footsteps thundered down the hallway, her breath sharp and ragged. She reached the foyer before she felt a hand, not rough, but firm, close around her arm. It was Thomas. His grip was steady but not cruel. "Please, Mrs. Hartwell," he said, his voice strained with something close to pleading. "Don't make this harder than it must be." That sentence, "harder than it must be," snapped something inside her. She pulled away with a ferocity that shocked them both, her nails scraping against the banister as she stumbled toward the front door. She reached for the handle, flinging the door open in a burst of desperate hope. But outside were the others. A half-circle of servants stood on the porch and in the courtyard, their expressions tense, frightened, regretful, but resolute. They had anticipated this moment. They had positioned themselves to prevent it. The sight of them, people she had clothed, housed, overseen for years, now standing as a barrier rather than as subordinates, filled her with a horror so absolute it dulled the heat of the sun and the sting of humiliation. She collapsed onto the porch steps, overwhelmed by the realization that there was no path she could take that did not lead back into the house. The confrontation did not end with shouting or violence. Instead, it unfolded with a chilling calm that made it all the more devastating. The servants surrounded her, not touching, not threatening, but enclosing her in a circle of responsibility they had redefined without her consent. Samuel emerged from the doorway moments later, carrying a small stack of papers and a fountain pen. He knelt beside her, not in subservience, but in a gesture that mimicked compassion. "There is one last matter to resolve," he said gently. "The bank requires your formal acknowledgement that the estate is under revised management. Once this is signed, all further disputes will cease. It will protect you from stress, and it will protect the estate." Eleanor stared at the papers, unable to speak. The cicadas had begun their shrill, merciless song. Sweat ran down the back of her neck. Her heart hammered against her ribs with the uneven rhythm of someone whose world had tilted so completely that she was no longer sure where the horizon lay. She whispered, "This is theft." Samuel's expression did not change. "It is preservation." The words hung in the heavy morning air, their meanings opposite, yet equally true. Blanche finally stepped forward, kneeling beside Eleanor with a look of raw regret. "We did not want this," she said, "but we could not let everything fall apart." Tears stung Eleanor's eyes, not from sentiment, but from the unbearable clarity of the moment. She saw them now not as conspirators, but as people crushed by the structure they themselves had upheld. A system built on hierarchy had consumed everyone inside it, blurring the lines between cruelty and necessity. The irreversible moment came when Samuel placed the pen in her hand. Her fingers trembled. Her arm felt impossibly heavy. She looked at the papers, dense blocks of legal text, quiet weapons masked as formalities, and felt something in her spirit crumble. She signed. The servants did not cheer, did not smile. They simply exhaled, their shoulders sagging with the release of a burden that had weighed on them as heavily as on her. When Eleanor finally looked up from the signature, she realized that although she still lived in the house, she no longer inhabited her own life. The estate, her inheritance, her legacy, her identity, had passed into the hands of those who claimed to protect her. And whether they had done so out of fear, ambition, duty, or desperation, she would never again be certain. The climax ended not with violence, but with the quiet horror of finality. The house stood silent as the new reality settled into place. And for Eleanor Hartwell, the true terror was just beginning. Living under the watchful eyes of those who now held everything she once controlled. In the days following the confrontation, the estate settled into a silence so complete that even the gulls along the riverbank seemed to avoid crossing into its air. Work did not resume in any recognizable pattern. The staff moved about cautiously, as if afraid to brush against the memory of what had unfolded. Where once there had been the ceaseless rhythm of the household, the clatter of carts, the dull strike of boots, the late evening murmur of voices exchanging the banalities of labor, now there existed a suspended, fragile quiet, and every sound felt like an intrusion into something shattered. Eleanor remained in her rooms at first, guarded primarily by her own exhaustion. She did not speak much, and when she did, her voice sounded as though it were borrowed from someone who had gone hoarse from years of arguments never voiced aloud. There was a stiffness in her posture, a restraint that suggested she had at last understood the extent of her own involvement in the destruction of her household. Not only the damage inflicted upon herself, but the wounds, visible and invisible, carved into the people who had lived beneath her authority. The servants regarded her with an expression that almost resembled pity, but never quite settled into it. Their eyes followed her movements through the corridors, cataloging the hesitations, the moments in which she seemed to reach for something that was not there, a bell, a command, a person she once believed she controlled. For some, her fall from certainty carried a dark, satisfying justice. For others, it was merely another reminder that power, once lost, collapses quickly and without ceremony, pulling down everyone within its radius. In the village, the stories began immediately. They always do. Even before anyone outside the estate had any tangible details, rumors blossomed from a single seed of uncertainty. A doctor had been summoned late at night. A constable had been seen visiting the house. The servants had taken to leaving at dawn and returning at unpredictable hours. And Eleanor, who once hosted luncheons that lasted entire afternoons and could recite the incomes of every family within 20 miles, had not been seen in public at all. By the third day, the first inaccurate account circulated in the tavern, that a death had occurred, that blood had soaked the rugs of the upper hall, that the constable had been overheard whispering the word charges. None of this was true, but the truth did not matter. It rarely does in the first retelling. What mattered was that the estate, which had once been a symbol of certainty, its routines, its rules, its enforced social order, now embodied the opposite: chaos, loss, and the uncomfortable realization that none of its values had protected those who lived inside. The servants who remained attempted to organize the household into something functional. Samuel, though shaken, resumed his duties with a quiet determination. Martha, who had once avoided prolonged eye contact with anyone in authority, now moved through the estate as if the walls themselves required reassurance. She spoke little of the confrontation, but once, while repairing a window latch in Eleanor's study, she said to Samuel, "There's something frightening about how easily a person can lose themselves. It only takes a few bad months, or a few bad decisions." To which Samuel answered, "Or a lifetime spent trusting the wrong things." As the days turned into a week, the official inquiries began. They always begin late, not because authorities are slow, but because communities prefer to handle their scandals with a certain internal discretion first. Then, when the situation inevitably spills over, the constable compiles his reports, the magistrate asks routine questions, and everyone involved performs a practiced dance of selective truth. Eleanor, when questioned, answered with clarity, not evasive, but cautious, choosing each word with the deliberation of someone who understands that language can decide whether a life is reconstructed or permanently dismantled. She did not attempt to shift blame onto the servants. She did not mention the moments of cruelty that had, until recently, seemed trivial enough to ignore. She simply admitted that she had lost control over the finances, over the estate's operations, over the tensions that had been building for years beneath the surface of her household. The constable, a man with a reputation for bluntness, asked her during the final day of inquiry, "Do you feel responsible for what happened?" Eleanor did not answer immediately. Her gaze drifted to the window behind him, beyond which the lawn extended in an uninterrupted sweep of pale winter grass. Then, with a steadiness that surprised even her, she said, "There is no version of events in which I am innocent." That sentence, though spoken quietly and without theatrical intention, earned its place in the later accounts. First written in the amateur newsletters circulated among the villages, later immortalized in a serialized retrospective published by a minor historian decades later. They did not quote her entirely accurately, but the sentiment survived intact, a statement of ownership over one's failings, something rare enough to become a curiosity. The magistrate concluded that while Eleanor's mismanagement had contributed to the collapse of order within the estate, no criminal charges would be filed. The incident, according to official record, was classified under the ambiguous category of domestic conflict resulting in crisis, a phrase vague enough to be applied to everything from a heated argument to the complete psychological unraveling of a household. The villagers disagreed, of course. They always do. Official documents exist for legal purposes. Communal narratives exist for moral ones. And morality, as every historian knows, is shaped far more by repetition than by fact. Within 2 weeks, the servants began to disperse. Some departed quietly, leaving before dawn with their belongings wrapped in canvas or bound with twine. Others stayed long enough to receive their final wages, which were paid from the last remaining reserve of the estate's finances. Samuel lingered longest, partly out of loyalty and partly because he wished to see Eleanor restored enough to stand without shaking. In the end, he, too, left, not abruptly, but in a way that suggested he was closing a chapter rather than fleeing it. Martha stayed, not permanently, but long enough to help stabilize what remained of Eleanor's life. The two women established a routine marked by mutual restraint. Morning tea taken in the kitchen rather than the dining room, accounts reviewed together rather than separately, and silence observed where words might cause more harm. Martha did not forgive Eleanor for the years of condescension and small humiliations, but forgiveness was not her purpose. Instead, she offered practical assistance, mending, cleaning, inventorying, and a presence that prevented the estate from collapsing into solitude. By the 3rd week, the house no longer felt haunted, not by ghosts, but by consequences. The rooms remained heavy, but not threatening. The corridors echoed less sharply. The air no longer felt expectant, as though waiting for the next moment of fracture. Eleanor ventured into the village for the first time after 21 days. She walked with a measured, unhurried step, aware of the eyes tracking her, aware of the whispered comments that swelled behind her and then softened when she turned her head. She did not attempt to hide from the attention, nor did she return any greetings with more than a nod. Her presence was not a plea for reintegration, but a statement, "I am still here." The weeks that followed produced new stories, quieter, more reflective ones. Some villagers spoke of Eleanor's sudden humility as evidence that she had undergone a moral awakening. Others suspected she was concealing something darker, though they never agreed on the nature of that darkness. A few, mostly the older residents, said nothing at all, choosing instead to wait and observe whether tragedy shaped her into someone better or simply someone smaller. The servants who had once labored under Eleanor's authority carried their own versions into the neighboring counties. Each account emphasized different details: a raised voice, a confession, a financial collapse, a loss of control, but all shared a common theme. The fragility of a household built on imbalanced power, and the ease with which small abuses accumulate into something that eventually detonates. Some months later, a local newspaper published a short column summarizing the unrest at the estate. It was sanitized, condensed, and stripped of emotional texture, but one sentence stood out sharply. In the aftermath, it remains unclear who among the inhabitants suffered most. The line was meant as a rhetorical flourish, yet it captured the heart of the matter with startling accuracy. Suffering, after all, is not a competition. It is a residue, clinging, staining, and often surviving long after the cause has withered. Eleanor, in her solitude, confronted that residue daily. She took long walks along the riverbank, sometimes pausing for an hour or more as though trying to listen for a voice that had long gone quiet. Other days, she immersed herself in records, attempting to salvage what little remained of the estate's viability. Her handwriting grew smaller, her decisions more careful, her posture less rigid. She was not undone, exactly, but she was altered in a way that suggested the damage had not destroyed her so much as reshaped her. Some evenings, Martha joined her for tea. Their conversations rarely touched on the past, not out of avoidance, but out of mutual understanding that they were both learning how to live in the aftermath. Once, though, Martha asked softly, "Do you ever wish things had gone differently?" Eleanor looked at her hands, hands that had once given orders with unthinking authority, and said, "I wish I had seen myself clearly sooner." Martha nodded. We all pretend not to see the things that make us uncomfortable. Some people just have more power to hide behind. Those words lingered, not only in Eleanor's mind, but in the later retellings, where they appeared as part of an interview conducted decades later with a historian collecting oral testimonies. The accuracy of the quote remains uncertain, but its sentiment fits well enough that most scholars accept it as authentic. Over time, the estate lost its grandeur but not its notoriety. Travelers passing through the county would sometimes pause to look toward its silhouette and ask locals, "Is that the house where?" only to find themselves interrupted by a shrug or a warning glance, or a story that seemed to change depending on the teller's mood. For some, the estate became a lesson in the dangers of unchecked authority. For others, it was simply another cautionary tale of human frailty. And, as always happens with stories born from discomfort, it eventually softened into folklore. Parents invoked it to teach their children humility. Neighbors referenced it when speaking of pride or secrecy. Visitors heard embellished versions involving secret rooms or hidden ledgers. None of this was accurate, but accuracy is rarely the objective of memory. What mattered was the legacy, a lingering sense that cruelty, even when minor in its individual acts, accumulates weight. That power, when misused, weaves itself into the walls of a home, into its routines, and into the lives of those who survive it. In the end, Eleanor lived quietly, neither shunned nor embraced, existing in the peculiar middle ground reserved for those whose actions were not monstrous enough to condemn entirely, yet harmful enough to be remembered. She tended her gardens. She paid her debts. She never reclaimed the social influence she once wielded, and she did not appear to want to. The final account of her life concludes with a simple observation written by a neighbor. She became someone who spoke softly, as though measuring the space her voice occupied. Whether this reflected guilt, wisdom, or fatigue remains unresolved, an ambiguity that grants the story its lasting power. YouTube-style closing/documentary outro. And perhaps that is the most disturbing part of this entire account. Not the confrontation, not the collapse of a household built on fragile hierarchies, but the quietness afterward, the way everyone involved chose their version of the truth, carried it with them, and built their futures around it. So here's the question I leave you with. When a structure collapses, a family, an estate, a life, is justice the moment the truth is exposed, or the years that follow, when everyone must decide what to remember and what to forget? Because sometimes the real horror is not what happened, but what survives.